Commander Zixthar stood on the bridge of the massive coalition ship and watched the small human transport dock with their vessel. His red scales caught the light from the stars outside as he moved his long neck to get a better view of the new arrivals. After 300 years of fighting across the galaxy, he had seen many species join the coalition, but these humans looked different from what he expected. The transport was tiny compared to other coalition ships and looked like it was built from scraps of metal welded together. The humans inside wore simple armor that reminded Zixthar of the primitive gear his own people used centuries ago, before they learned to make energy shields. Their weapons were basic projectile launchers that fired small metal pieces instead of the plasma beams and energy rifles that proper coalition forces carried into battle. Captain Jake Morrison stepped through the airlock first, and Zixthar could see immediately that this human was small even by the standards of his own species. Most coalition warriors stood at least 8 feet tall with natural weapons like claws or acid sacs or telepathic abilities that made them deadly in combat. This human barely reached 6 feet and had no visible natural weapons at all. His skin was soft and pink without scales or armor plating, and his teeth were flat instead of sharp. Behind Jake came 3 more humans who looked just as unremarkable. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez carried what appeared to be a modified projectile weapon with strange attachments that Zixthar did not recognize. Sergeant Ben Clark moved with the confidence of a veteran soldier, but his equipment looked ancient compared to coalition standard gear. Corporal Lisa Hayes seemed barely old enough to fight and carried a pack that was almost as big as she was. The humans walked across the hangar bay toward where Zixthar waited with the other coalition commanders, and he noticed that they moved differently than other species. Most coalition races either moved with the fluid grace of predators or the heavy steps of natural tanks, but humans seemed to bounce slightly with each step as if they were always ready to change direction quickly. Their eyes moved constantly, scanning everything around them instead of focusing straight ahead like proper soldiers. Admiral Carthes of the Altarian High Command greeted the humans with the formal coalition welcome ceremony, but Zixthar could see that the humans were not impressed by the display of honor guards and energy weapons. Instead, they seemed more interested in the technical specifications of the ship and kept asking questions about power systems and weapon capabilities that showed they understood technology better than he had expected. During the briefing in the main conference room, Zixthar learned more about what the humans could contribute to the coming battle against the Vorth swarm. The humans had only been spacefaring for a few decades, and their entire military consisted of a few thousand soldiers and maybe 50 combat ships. Their technology was so primitive that their fastest ships could barely travel between star systems, and their weapons could not even penetrate coalition shield systems. But Captain Jake Morrison presented their tactical analysis of previous battles against the Vorth, and Zixthar had to admit that their understanding of enemy patterns was surprisingly sophisticated. The humans had studied every engagement the coalition had fought against the swarm, and identified weaknesses that veteran commanders had missed. They suggested modifications to standard battle formations that could exploit gaps in Vorth defensive lines. The briefing also revealed the true scope of what they faced at Kepler Station. The Vorth swarm was not just another enemy fleet, but a living nightmare that consumed entire star systems and turned them into breeding grounds for more biomechanical ships. 3 coalition battle groups had already fallen to their overwhelming numbers, and now the swarm was approaching the inner colonies where billions of civilians waited for protection. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez asked direct questions about evacuation procedures and backup defensive positions that made Zixthar realize these humans were already planning for the possibility of defeat. Most coalition species preferred to focus on glory and honor in battle, but the humans seemed more concerned with practical survival strategies and protecting non-combatants. As the meeting ended and the various species returned to their ships, to prepare for battle, Zixthar found himself walking beside Sergeant Ben Clark toward the human quarters. The human soldier was examining the corridor walls and ceiling with the same careful attention he had shown during the tactical briefing, and Zixthar asked him what he was looking for. Ben explained that he was memorizing the layout of the ship in case they needed to fight aboard it later, and wanted to know where the important systems were located. This kind of preparation was standard for human soldiers, but completely foreign to Zixthar, who had always assumed that ship-to-ship combat would be fought in space rather than in corridors. The conversation continued as they reached the human section, and Zixthar learned that these strange creatures had been fighting each other on their home planet for thousands of years before they learned to travel to the stars. They had developed tactics for every kind of environment and situation, including battles inside spaceships, underground, in cities, and even underwater. Their experience with constant warfare had taught them to adapt quickly to new situations and use whatever tools were available. That night, as Zixthar prepared for sleep in his quarters, he found himself thinking about the humans and wondering if the Coalition had made a mistake by allowing such a primitive species to join their forces. But something about their confidence and their careful preparation made him curious to see how they would perform when the real fighting began. The next morning, Zixthar woke to strange sounds coming from the human section of the ship and decided to investigate what the new allies were doing to prepare for battle. What he found in their quarters surprised him more than anything he had seen in his long military career. Instead of the quiet meditation or weapon ceremonies that other species performed before combat, the humans were making loud noises and seemed to be enjoying themselves. Captain Jake Morrison was telling stories about previous battles on Earth while the other humans laughed and made comments that Zixthar did not understand. They called it sharing war stories, but to the reptilian commander it looked more like a social gathering than military preparation. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was cleaning her weapon while singing something she called a marching song, and Sergeant Ben Clark was showing Corporal Lisa Hayes how to modify her ammunition for better performance against bioarmor. The humans had somehow acquired spare parts from the ship's engineering section and were busy attaching Coalition energy cells to their primitive projectile weapons. What should not have worked according to any reasonable understanding of technology was actually functioning and creating hybrid weapons that combined the best features of both systems. Their modified rifles could now fire energy-enhanced projectiles that would penetrate shields while still delivering the kinetic impact that their original weapons provided. Colonel Danny Wright arrived to check on his soldiers, and Zixthar was impressed by how efficiently the human commander organized his small force. Despite having only a few dozen Marines, the humans had established a clear chain of command and assigned specific roles to each soldier based on their individual skills, rather than following the standard Coalition practice of identical training for all troops. During the morning briefing, Admiral Karthes presented the final battle plan, and Zixthar could see that the situation was even worse than they had originally thought. Long-range sensors showed that the Vorth swarm had grown larger during their approach and now included massive capital ships that had never been seen before. The biomechanical vessels were covered in what appeared to be living armor that could regenerate damage faster than conventional weapons could inflict it. The Coalition strategy was straightforward and desperate. They would form a defensive line around Kepler Station and fight until the civilian evacuation ships could escape to the inner colonies. No one expected to survive the battle, but their sacrifice would buy time for billions of innocent people to reach safety. Each species commander accepted this fate with the stoic dignity that was expected of Coalition officers. But Lieutenant Colonel Kate Palmer raised her hand and asked about alternative escape routes and backup defensive positions that could be used if the main battle line collapsed. Her questions showed that the humans were not planning to make a glorious last stand, but were instead thinking about how to continue fighting, even after the official battle plan failed. This practical approach to warfare was completely different from Coalition tradition. After the briefing, Zixthar found himself assigned to work with Major Chris Henderson, who commanded the human fighter squadron. The human pilots had taken their small primitive spacecraft and somehow managed to integrate Coalition shield generators and targeting systems without destroying the basic airframe. Their fighters now had capabilities that rivaled much more advanced Coalition designs. Chris explained that human pilots trained differently than other species because they could not rely on natural reflexes or telepathic coordination like many Coalition races. Instead, they used constant communication and coordinated tactics that allowed them to work together as a unified force. Their radio chatter sounded chaotic to Zixthar, but he could see that it actually provided better coordination than the silent, telepathic links used by more advanced species. The human approach to space combat was based on lessons learned from atmospheric flight on their home planet, where pilots had to deal with gravity weather and limited fuel supplies. These constraints had taught them to use momentum and positioning more effectively than species that had developed their tactics in the vacuum of space. They could perform maneuvers that other pilots considered impossible. As the hours passed, before the expected arrival of the Vorth swarm, Zixthar spent more time observing the human preparations and found himself both puzzled and impressed by their methods. They did not seem to fear death the way other species did, but they also did not embrace it with the fatalistic acceptance that coalition tradition demanded. Instead, they acted as if survival was possible through clever planning and aggressive tactics. Corporal Lisa Hayes was working on something she called contingency plans that covered dozens of different scenarios, including fighting inside disabled ships, boarding enemy vessels, and even continuing combat after their main weapons were destroyed. She had studied the layout of every coalition ship in the fleet and identified alternative fighting positions that could be used if their original battle stations were compromised. The humans also performed maintenance on their equipment differently than other coalition forces. Instead of simply checking that systems were functioning properly, they modified and improved everything they could reach. Their armor now included additional protection made from salvaged materials, and their weapons had been adjusted for better performance against the specific threats they expected to face. Captain Steve Morgan, who commanded the human vessel Liberty's Edge, showed Zixthar around his ship and explained how they had prepared for the coming battle. The humans had installed additional armor plating around critical systems and created backup control stations that could operate the ship even if the main bridge was destroyed. They had also stockpiled extra ammunition and medical supplies in hidden compartments throughout the vessel. What impressed Zixthar most was that the humans had prepared their ship not just for space combat, but for close quarters fighting inside the corridors. They had identified choke points where a small force could hold off larger numbers, and had positioned weapons caches at strategic locations. The entire vessel had been turned into a fortress that could continue fighting even after it was boarded by enemy forces. As the final hours before battle ticked away, Zixthar realized that these strange primitive humans had brought something to the coalition that had been missing from their previous encounters with the Vorth swarm. While other species focused on honor duty and glorious sacrifice, the humans were focused on winning. They approached warfare not as a test of courage, but as a problem to be solved through intelligence, creativity, and absolute determination to achieve victory regardless of the cost. The alarm that signaled the arrival of the Vorth swarm echoed through every corridor of the coalition fleet, and Zixthar felt his warrior instincts activate as he had countless times before in his long military career. But when he reached the bridge and saw what was emerging from hyperspace, his confidence wavered for the first time in decades. The enemy force was beyond anything the coalition had ever faced. Millions of biomechanical ships poured out of the swirling portal that connected distant star systems and filled the space around Kepler Station like a living cloud of death. The smallest Vorth vessels were the size of coalition fighters, but moved with the fluid grace of living creatures, while the largest capital ships stretched for kilometers and pulsed with organic veins that carried acidic ammunition through their hull plating. The Vorth fleet formed attack patterns that no artificial intelligence could have coordinated, and Zixthar realized that they were facing a hive mind that controlled every ship as extensions of a single consciousness. The biomechanical vessels began advancing toward the coalition defensive line with perfect synchronization, while their living armor plates shifted and adapted to provide better protection against incoming fire. Admiral Carthes gave the order to open fire, and the space between the two fleets exploded with energy beams, plasma torpedoes, and particle cannons that lit up the darkness like artificial stars. The coalition had assembled the largest battle fleet in their history, and their combined firepower should have been enough to destroy any conventional enemy force, but the Vorth ships absorbed the damage and continued advancing without any reduction in their coordinated attack patterns. Zixthar launched his fighter squadron alongside Major Chris Henderson and the human pilots, and immediately discovered that fighting the Vorth required tactics that no coalition academy had ever taught. The enemy vessels moved like living creatures that could predict where energy weapons would fire and adjust their flight paths to minimize damage. Their bioarmor regenerated holes from plasma beams within seconds, and their acidic return fire ate through coalition shields like they were made of paper. But the human fighters performed differently than Zixthar had expected, and he watched. in amazement as their primitive kinetic weapons proved more effective against Vorth bioarmor than the advanced energy systems that other coalition forces relied upon. The metal projectiles that human weapons fired punched through regenerating tissue and remained embedded in enemy hulls, where they continued to cause internal damage that prevented proper healing. Chris Henderson coordinated his pilots using rapid radio communication that allowed them to adapt their tactics faster than the Vorth hive mind could respond, and Zixthar found himself struggling to keep up with their constant changes in formation and attack patterns. The humans fought like they were playing some kind of complex game where the rules changed every few seconds, and victory went to whoever could think fastest. The battle intensified as Vorth capital ships began deploying their heaviest weapons, and Zixthar watched coalition vessels disappear in bursts of acidic fire that dissolved both armor and crew in seconds. The enemy bioships seemed to feel no pain when they were damaged and continued fighting, even when half their mass had been blown away by direct hits from coalition plasma cannons. Then something happened that changed everything Zixthar thought he knew about human psychology and combat doctrine. The coalition heavy cruiser Eternal Glory took critical damage from concentrated Vorth fire and began falling toward the planet below with its crew trapped inside. According to standard coalition protocol, the crew should have activated their escape pods and abandoned the dying vessel to preserve their lives for future battles. Instead, Captain Steve Morgan piloted the human ship Liberty's Edge directly into the path of the falling cruiser and used his vessel's tractor beam to push the damaged coalition ship away from the planet's gravity well. The maneuver put the human vessel directly in the firing line of 3 Vorth capital ships, and Zixthar expected to see both ships destroyed within seconds. But Morgan did something that no coalition officer would have considered. He ordered his crew to sing their battle hymns over the ship's communication system, while he piloted Liberty's Edge on a collision course toward the largest Vorth vessel. The humans were not trying to escape or minimize their losses, but were instead using their own ship as a weapon to maximize damage to the enemy fleet. The collision between Liberty's Edge and the Vorth capital ship created an explosion that tore a hole in the enemy formation and allowed coalition forces to regroup around the damaged cruiser. But Zixthar realized that the humans had not sacrificed themselves out of desperation or honor, but had calculated that their action would create the maximum tactical advantage for their allies. As the battle continued, Zixthar found himself flying beside human pilots who treated combat like it was a puzzle to be solved, rather than a test of courage to be endured. When conventional tactics failed, they immediately tried something different, and when their weapons proved ineffective, they modified them in the middle of battle using spare parts and tools that no reasonable person would bring into space combat. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez contacted him over the radio to coordinate an attack on a cluster of Vorth bioships, and Zixthar was amazed by how quickly she had adapted to fighting an enemy that none of them had ever encountered before. She had already identified weaknesses in Vorth formation patterns and developed counter-tactics that exploited gaps in their coordination that even experienced coalition commanders had missed. The humans were not just fighting to survive or to protect their honor, but were actively trying to win a battle that every military expert had declared impossible. They approached the Vorth swarm, not as an unstoppable force of nature, but as an enemy that could be defeated through intelligence determination, an absolute refusal to accept the limitations that other species considered inevitable. As more coalition ships fell to the overwhelming Vorth assault, Zixthar began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic warfare. The humans were not better fighters than other coalition species, and their technology was clearly inferior. But they possessed something that made them more dangerous than enemies twice their size. They had the ability to continue thinking and adapting even when facing certain death, and this made them unpredictable in ways that the Vorth hive mind could not anticipate or counter. The battle reached its darkest moment when the Vorth deployed weapons that the coalition had never seen before, and Zixthar watched in horror as massive bioships began firing spores that attached themselves to coalition vessels and started converting the metal hulls into living tissue. The infection spread rapidly through the fleet, turning allied ships into extensions of the Vorth hive mind, and creating enemies that knew all coalition tactics and communication codes. Zixthar's own vessel, The Crimson Talon shuddered under impact, from infected biomatter that ate through the hull plating like acid, and began spreading tendrils throughout the ship's internal systems. The bridge crew tried to activate emergency protocols, but the infection had already reached the computer cores and was using coalition technology against itself in ways that no defensive system could counter. Panic spread through the coalition fleet as more ships fell to the bio-infection and began turning their weapons against former allies. Admiral Karthess ordered a general retreat, but the converted vessels had positioned themselves to block escape routes and were using their knowledge of coalition tactics to predict every move that the remaining friendly forces attempted to make. The Crimson Talon lost main power as the bio-infection reached the engine room, and Zixthar found himself trapped on a dying ship with hostile organisms pouring through corridors that had been sealed against vacuum, but could not stop living creatures that adapted to whatever environment they encountered. He expected to die fighting with honor as his warrior traditions demanded, but what happened next changed everything. He thought he knew about combat. A squad of human Marines led by Sergeant Alex Carter blasted through the infected sections of the ship using weapons that Zixthar had never seen before and tactics that violated every rule of shipboard combat that the Coalition military academies taught their officers. The humans were using explosive charges in pressurized corridors, throwing grenades in enclosed spaces, and fighting with a complete disregard for their own safety that should have gotten them all killed within minutes. But instead of dying, the humans were winning. They moved through the infected ship like they had been training for this exact situation their entire lives, and used every piece of equipment around them as potential weapons. When their ammunition ran low, they grabbed maintenance tools from emergency lockers and turned power conduits into improvised flamethrowers that burned away Vorth biomatter more effectively than military weapons designed for the purpose. Sergeant Carter coordinated his Marines using simple hand signals and shouted commands that somehow provided better tactical coordination than the sophisticated communication systems that other coalition forces relied upon. The humans could adapt their plans instantly when they encountered unexpected obstacles, and worked together with an efficiency that seemed impossible for individuals who lacked telepathic links or hive mind connections. Zixthar followed the human Marines as they fought their way toward the ship's reactor core, where the main bio-infection was spreading, and he watched them solve problems that experienced coalition engineers had declared impossible. When they found corridors blocked by acidic biomatter, Private Maria Santos suggested using the ship's fire suppression system to freeze the organic material until it became brittle enough to break through with kinetic impact. The plan worked, but it required someone to manually activate the emergency systems from inside the infected section, where exposure to Vorth organisms meant certain death. Without hesitation, Maria volunteered for the mission, and Zixthar watched her crawl through maintenance ducts filled with hostile biomatter, while her fellow Marines provided covering fire against creatures that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. What terrified Zixthar was not the danger that surrounded them, but the casual way that the humans accepted impossible odds and continued fighting as if victory was inevitable. They did not seem to understand that they were facing an enemy that had destroyed 3 coalition battle groups and converted entire star systems into breeding grounds for more biomechanical ships. When Maria reached the emergency controls, she found that the bio-infection had already merged with the ship's computer systems and was actively fighting against her attempts to activate the fire suppression systems. Instead of retreating, she began manually rewiring control circuits while Vorth organisms attacked her from every direction, and acid ate through her armor plating. The other Marines continued their advance toward the reactor core, and Zixthar realized that they were not just trying to save their own lives but were planning to prevent the Crimson Talon from being converted into another weapon for the Vorth fleet. They intended to destroy the ship's power systems, even if it meant being trapped aboard a vessel that was drifting powerless in the middle of a battle zone. Private Tommy Phillips found the main bio-infection cluster growing around the reactor core and immediately began setting explosive charges that would destroy the entire power plant, along with anyone who remained aboard the ship. When Zixthar asked him why he was not trying to find an escape route, Tommy explained that preventing one more ship from joining the Vorth fleet was worth any personal sacrifice. The human attitude toward death and victory was completely different. from anything Zixthar had encountered in his 3 centuries of military service. Coalition species fought for honor, duty, or survival, but humans fought for something deeper that seemed to make individual lives less important than achieving objectives that benefited their entire species. Maria Santos succeeded in activating the fire suppression system just as the biomatter reached her position, and Zixthar watched her fall under a wave of acidic organisms while the frozen corridors around them shattered like glass under kinetic impact from marine weapons. She activated a final grenade that cleared the path to the reactor core, but sacrificed herself to ensure that her fellow humans could complete their mission. As the Marines fought their way through the cleared corridors toward the reactor, Zixthar began to understand what made humans different from every other species in the Coalition. They possessed an absolute refusal to accept defeat that went beyond courage or honor or duty, and extended into something that could only be described as pure stubborn determination to keep fighting regardless of logic or probability. The humans were not better warriors than other Coalition species, but they were more dangerous because they could not be intimidated or discouraged or convinced to surrender even when facing impossible odds. They treated every setback as a temporary obstacle, and every loss as motivation to fight harder, rather than evidence that victory was impossible. When they reached the reactor core and began preparing the explosive charges that would destroy their own ship, Zixthar realized that he was witnessing something that the galaxy had never seen before, and that the Vorth swarm had never encountered in their conquest of countless star systems. The explosion that destroyed the Crimson Talon's reactor core sent shockwaves through space that disrupted Vorth bioships for several kilometers in every direction, and Zixthar found himself floating in an escape pod alongside the surviving human Marines who had somehow managed to evacuate him from the dying vessel. As he watched his former command break apart and burn, he realized that the humans had not just saved his life, but had prevented the Vorth from gaining another converted ship for their fleet. Through the escape pod's communication system, he could hear Admiral Jack Murphy coordinating what remained of the human fleet using tactics that made no sense, according to standard Coalition military doctrine. Instead of retreating to regroup or attempting to break through the Vorth lines to escape, the Admiral was ordering his ships to form defensive clusters around the evacuation zones, where civilian transports were still loading refugees from Kepler Station. The human strategy violated every principle of space warfare that Zixthar had learned during his military career, because it involved deliberately placing their forces in positions where they could be surrounded and destroyed by superior numbers. But as he listened to the radio chatter between human ships, he began to understand that they were not planning to escape or survive, but were instead implementing something they called the Alamo Protocol. Commander Nicole Fraser contacted Murphy over the Fleet Communication Network to propose a plan that Zixthar immediately recognized as completely insane. She wanted to take a combined strike force of human and Coalition ships directly through the heaviest Vorth defenses to attack the enemy command vessels that were coordinating the biomechanical swarm from the center of their formation. The plan was based on intelligence that the humans had gathered about Vorth tactics during the battle, and their theory that the hive mind controlling the swarm created a critical vulnerability that could be exploited by forces willing to sacrifice everything for a single decisive strike. If they could destroy or disrupt the command nodes, the entire Vorth fleet would lose coordination and become vulnerable to conventional attacks. What terrified Zixthar was not the danger of the mission, but the calm way that Nicole Fraser explained her reasoning and the immediate acceptance that her plan received from other human commanders. They were proposing to fly directly into the heart of the Vorth fleet, where millions of bioships waited to tear apart any vessel that approached their command structures. But the humans had calculated that the Vorth hive mind's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness, because the command ships had to maintain constant communication with their entire fleet, and could not take evasive action without disrupting the coordination that made the swarm so effective. A small fast strike force could reach the command vessels before the hive mind could redeploy enough ships to stop them. The escape pod was recovered by the Coalition destroyer Righteous Fury, and Zixthar found himself assigned to Nicole Fraser's strike force along with the surviving human Marines from his former ship. As they prepared for what everyone understood would be a one-way mission, he watched the humans make final preparations with the same careful attention to detail that they had shown throughout the battle. Sergeant Alex Carter distributed modified weapons and ammunition that the Marines had prepared specifically for fighting inside Vorth bioships, where conventional energy weapons would be less effective than kinetic projectiles and explosive charges. The humans had studied the enemy vessels during the battle and identified weak points in their living armor that could be exploited by boarding parties armed with the right equipment. Private Tommy Phillips volunteered to lead the boarding assault on the primary command ship, and Zixthar realized that the young human understood exactly what he was agreeing to do. The biomechanical vessels were filled with acidic atmosphere and hostile organisms that would kill any boarders within minutes. But the humans had developed protective equipment and tactics that might allow them to survive long enough to plant explosives in critical locations. As the strike force formed up around Nicole Fraser's modified cruiser, Zixthar found himself flying alongside human pilots, who treated the upcoming suicide mission like it was just another tactical problem to be solved through careful planning and aggressive execution. They had identified approach routes that would minimize exposure to Vorth defensive fire and calculated the exact timing needed to reach the command ships before the hive mind could respond. The flight through the Vorth fleet was unlike anything Zixthar had experienced in 3 centuries of space combat, and he watched human pilots perform maneuvers that should have been impossible while navigating through a maze of biomechanical ships that fired acidic projectiles and deployed living interceptors designed to attach themselves to enemy vessels and consume them from the inside. But the humans had prepared for every threat that the Vorth could deploy, and their modified ships carried countermeasures that neutralized bioweapons and defensive systems that could repel boarding organisms. When living interceptors attached themselves to the hull of Fraser's cruiser, the human crew activated electrical fields that killed the organic attackers, and then used the dead biomatter as additional armor plating. The strike force reached the Vorth command cluster after losing half their ships to concentrated enemy fire, and Zixthar watched the surviving human vessels launch boarding pods directly at the largest biomechanical vessels that pulsed with the neural activity needed to coordinate millions of individual ships. The pods were designed to penetrate living armor and deliver assault teams directly into the heart of enemy command structures. As his own boarding pod slammed into the side of a Vorth command ship, Zixthar felt fear for the first time in his long military career, but it was not fear of death or pain or failure. It was fear of understanding what humans really were beneath their soft skin and primitive technology. They were not just another coalition species that happened to be good at warfare, but something fundamentally different that the galaxy had never encountered before. The interior of the Vorth ship was a nightmare of pulsing organic walls that secreted acid and living corridors that tried to close around intruders like digestive tracts designed to break down anything that entered them. But the human Marines moved through the hostile environment like they had been born for this kind of fighting, and used every obstacle as an opportunity to demonstrate their incredible adaptability. When acid ate through their armor, they sealed the holes with emergency patches and kept advancing. When living walls tried to crush them, they used explosive charges to blast new passages through organic tissue. When hostile organisms attacked them from every direction, they coordinated their defensive fire with an efficiency that seemed impossible for creatures that lacked telepathic communication. Zixthar followed Tommy Phillips toward what appeared to be the command ship's central nervous system, and realized that he was witnessing something that would change galactic warfare forever. The humans were not just fighting to survive or complete their mission, but were actively enjoying the challenge of overcoming obstacles that should have been impossible for any individual species to defeat. The assault on the Vorth command node succeeded beyond what any military strategist would have considered possible, and Zixthar watched the enemy fleet lose coordination as their hive mind connections were severed by explosive charges that Tommy Phillips and his team had placed throughout the biomechanical nerve centers. Millions of Vorth ships suddenly found themselves operating as individuals instead of extensions of a single consciousness, and their perfect attack formations collapsed into chaos. But the victory came at a cost that shocked even Zixthar, who had witnessed the worst battles in Coalition history. 70% of the human fleet had been destroyed during the final assault, and thousands of their Marines had died in boarding actions against enemy vessels that were designed to kill any living creature that entered them. The space around the command ships was filled with debris from human vessels that had sacrificed themselves to ensure that the strike force could reach its objectives. Private Tommy Phillips had been killed when the Vorth command ship's nervous system released a final burst of acidic fluid that dissolved his protective suit, but not before he activated the charges that destroyed the primary coordination node. Sergeant Alex Carter had died leading the assault on a secondary command vessel, and dozens of other human Marines had given their lives to ensure that the Vorth fleet could never again function as a unified force. Yet as rescue ships collected survivors from the shattered remains of both fleets, Zixthar found himself in a medical bay next to Lieutenant Jake Morrison, who had lost his right arm during the fighting, but was already making jokes about how he would have to learn to shoot left-handed. The human pilot seemed more concerned about when he could return to duty than about the permanent injury that would have ended most coalition careers. Captain Rachel Williams, who had taken command after Admiral Murphy's ship was destroyed, was already coordinating reconstruction efforts before the evacuation transports had even reached safe distance from the battle zone. The humans were not just celebrating their survival, but were immediately beginning to plan for the next phase of the war against the Vorth swarm. The human approach to victory was as alien to Zixthar as their approach to combat had been. Instead of mourning their losses or claiming glory for their achievements, they were analyzing what they had learned about Vorth technology and tactics to develop better strategies for future engagements. They treated each battle as a source of information that could be used to improve their effectiveness against enemies they had not yet encountered. Rachel Williams presented her preliminary report to the surviving coalition commanders, and Zixthar was amazed by the depth of analysis that the humans had completed. Even while fighting for their lives, they had identified weaknesses in Vorth biomechanical systems that could be exploited by modified weapons, and had developed boarding tactics that could be used against enemy command ships in future battles. The humans had also begun studying captured Vorth technology to understand how biomechanical systems could be integrated with coalition equipment to create hybrid weapons that combined the best features of both technologies. Their natural curiosity and engineering skills allowed them to reverse engineer enemy innovations faster than species that had been studying Vorth systems for decades. As Zixthar prepared his own after-action report, he struggled to find words that could adequately describe what he had witnessed during the battle. The humans had not won through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through something that the coalition had never encountered before. They possessed an absolute conviction that defeat was not acceptable even when facing impossible odds. The report would recommend that human tactical flexibility and psychological resilience be studied and integrated into coalition military doctrine. But Zixthar knew that no amount of training could teach other species to think like humans. Their approach to warfare was based on thousands of years of conflict on their home planet, where survival required constant adaptation and innovation. What made humans truly dangerous was not their weapons or their tactics, but their complete refusal to accept limitations that other species considered natural laws. They treated every problem as something that could be solved through intelligence, determination, and willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. This made them unpredictable in ways that even the most sophisticated enemy could not anticipate. Lieutenant Colonel Kate Palmer found Zixthar in the medical bay and thanked him for his service during the battle, but he realized that she was already thinking about the next engagement and how the lessons learned from fighting the Vorth could be applied to other threats that the coalition might face. The humans did not see victory as an endpoint, but as a beginning that opened new possibilities for exploration and expansion. As the coalition fleet began its journey back toward the inner colonies, Zixthar spent hours watching Earth through the observation ports and trying to understand how such a small blue planet had produced a species that could change the course of galactic warfare. The humans called their world the cradle of humanity, but he now understood that it was something more significant. Earth was where humans had learned that survival required becoming something that the universe had never seen before. They had evolved not just intelligence and tool use, but an absolute determination to overcome any obstacle regardless of the personal cost. This made them the most valuable allies that the coalition could ever have, and the most terrifying enemies that any species could face. The fear that Zixthar had discovered during the battle was not fear of death or defeat, but fear of understanding what humans represented for the future of galactic civilization. They were not just another species that happened to be good at fighting, but pioneers of a completely new approach to existence that refused to accept any limitation as permanent. In his private quarters that night, Zixthar added a personal note to his official report that he knew would be classified at the highest levels of Coalition command. The humans fought as if they had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and this psychological approach to warfare made them more dangerous than any weapon or technology that the galaxy had ever produced. The note concluded with an observation that would haunt Coalition military planners for generations to come. Humans did not just fight battles or win wars, but approached every challenge with the same relentless determination that had allowed them to survive on a planet where evolution favored adaptability over specialization. They were not trying to preserve their current status, but were actively working to become something greater than what they had been before. As sleep finally came to the exhausted Coalition commander, Zixthar realized that he had witnessed the beginning of a new era in galactic history. The humans had joined the Coalition, not as junior partners seeking protection, but as a force that would reshape everything that older species thought they knew about warfare survival and the possibilities that existed for intelligent life in a dangerous universe.